Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show Ben de Waal. And we're starting a series. We'll see how many of these episodes we do, probably for a while now, that's focused on Bitcoin. And this one in particular is, what is Bitcoin? So getting into the fundamentals of Bitcoin. And really, this was spurred on, as I discussed in the episode, from a friend of mine who said, okay, I've heard about the human rights arguments, the environmental arguments about Bitcoin mining and things like that we love to talk about on this show. But, what are the fundamentals behind Bitcoin? Like, what is it? How does it work? So that's exactly what we try to tackle as concisely as possible in about an hour and a half with this episode with Ben. And we'll be sure to do others as well throughout the year, focusing on this, anticipating a bull run, anticipating more people getting into Bitcoin, becoming curious. We're going to provide some context and provide some fundamental videos and podcasts for folks as well to learn about Bitcoin and how it works, what's going on, Bitcoin mining, proof of work, Lightning, why does it have value? Does it have value? All of these different topics we cover in this episode and many more that we'll be doing. So we'd definitely love your feedback on this episode. And as always, you can reach out and give us feedback on this show and what things we might have missed, what you want to hear more from us. You can reach out to me at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. But Ben, some of you might know Ben, he's been around in this space for quite a while, being in Bitcoin since 2013. He's a software developer. He's a cypherpunk, I would say, really passionate about these things. He's worked at companies like Swan, and now he's doing a lot of Bitcoin consulting for different companies and projects, focusing on Bitcoin and engineering, architecture, things like that. So he was the perfect person to talk to about Bitcoin fundamentals. We used a lot of analogies. We got a little technical in some areas. So if some of it was a little too complex for you, as I've mentioned in this conversation, that's okay. We've given you some good nuggets to think about and to dig deeper into, which will provide more resources in the coming weeks about. So hopefully this was a good intro to some. Whether you're a veteran or whether you're new to Bitcoin, I think there's something for everyone in this episode, and really enjoyed this conversation with Ben. So thank you so much, Ben, for coming on, and encourage all of you to share this episode very far and wide for people that want a better understanding of Bitcoin. All right, before we get to the episode, do not forget about our promo and discount links from Bitbox and Saz Mining in the show notes, and would encourage you all to check out our Substack as well, where we have a weekly newsletter and episodes of the podcast delivered directly to your inbox, so you can sign up for that free newsletter today. All right, I will let you get to the episode, and we will see you again next week. Hello, Ben. Welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to get into this conversation. As I kind of described to folks on Twitter and described to you, and I'll say it for those listening that haven't seen these previous messages, one thing that spurred me on to have this conversation of what is Bitcoin is I was literally hanging out with a friend a few weeks ago. The same friend who's been slowly getting into Bitcoin and stuff like that is really into coins and gold coins and understanding sound money, one of those types.
Yep.
And our show, very specifically, we focus a lot on progressive value stuff like the environment and fighting FUD from the left on like environment, Bitcoin mining, human rights, like why Bitcoin is really important. So I think we're doing a relatively good job of that, because a lot of friends I have are like, oh, I see that Bitcoin is like relevant. I see that like it's important in the world and the use cases. But I've had a few friends, including this friend I just described, say, but like, what is it? Like, how does it work? Like, what are the fundamentals? Like, he's like, can you recommend any things to me? Which, I have recommended several videos, and there's a lot of folks, talking about that and doing good work in that. And I was like, well, you know what, from our platform, why don't we take a stab at it? Some of these episodes that can be, it's hard to make anything in Bitcoin that's truly timeless, right? But an episode that you could float around for a few months, a year or two, and say, this is kind of gets into some fundamentals of Bitcoin. So I plan on doing this with you. As I've said, I plan on doing this with other guests, because each guest will have different thoughts on what is some of the most important things to cover in Bitcoin. So you had sent over a few topics to me that I'm really excited to get into. Now, for those guests that are kind of coming into the podcast, that I hope this podcast will be widely shared with those that aren't in the Bitcoin ecosystem and really just looking for what is Bitcoin. This might be the first pod they hear from us, or a Bitcoin pod. Can you give people a little bit of a background of of who you are. I mean, you've got a lot of different things in your background that I think are really interesting and exciting. But if you want to give people a little background to who you are.
Sure thing. I'm always careful with this question, who am I? Because, yeah, like you just said, there's a lot in my background. I could
Hmm.
talk for far too long on that. So, kind of the brief version and probably what's relevant to your audience is I come from a technical background primarily. I actually studied a few different things in my career. I've actually gone through things like neuropharmacology. I'm a qualified and licensed private investigator in the state of New South Wales, Australia. Um, I've studied linguistics formally, so a bunch of stuff like that. But most of my career was spent as a software developer. So I've spent most of my career writing software. I moved from there more into then architecture, management, that kind of thing. So basically, figuring out how best to put bits of software together, how best to organize teams that create bits of software. And along with that comes a lot of kind of educational stuff. So not only is it managing teams, it's teaching people how stuff works and figuring out, how all of these pieces fit together and then explaining why that's the best way for all of these pieces to fit together. So that's kind of my formal background. As it happens, I've been an anarchist most of my life. So politically speaking, so left wing, very focused on the idea of reducing the interference of any kind of unnecessary hierarchies. So that includes things not only like governments, but also like corporations and so on. At some point, the distinction gets blurred anyway, and that's always been a big problem of mine. So I discovered Bitcoin and said, this is something which aligns with my values. This is something which aligns with my interests. That was around 2010 that I first discovered Bitcoin. At the time, though, I was just about to become a father, and lots of other stuff was happening in my life. So I kind of shelved it for a few years, kind of rediscovered it in 2013 and said, hold on, this thing's not dead yet. What's going on? Why has this thing not been turned off? Why hasn't the government come along and figured out how to shut it down? So I looked into it in more detail and said, hold on, they can't. This is actually something really valuable. This is something really interesting. This is actually money by the people for the people. We need to figure out, what can we do with this? How can we, make Bitcoin into the global monetary standard? And of course, that's kind of when I said, okay, I have to start doing more in this space. So left my fiat job, my traditional old job, in 2017, and I've been working in the Bitcoin space ever since. I've worked for some relatively large, well-known companies in the space, like Lightning Labs, like Swan Bitcoin. But aside from those, I've also been spending most of my time as an independent consultant, helping individuals and especially companies integrate Bitcoin into their systems, into their workflows, that kind of thing. And at the moment, I'm working very closely with a company called Musket, who are essentially a merchant solutions organization. So, making next generation Bitcoin based merchant solutions.
Very cool. And I'll also add, because I know you've talked about it many times before, not for us to go super in depth here in this conversation, but for folks to know, like you live, correct me if I'm wrong, on a relatively Bitcoin standard.
I do
So
indeed.
not only are we going to talk about fundamentals of Bitcoin, but you're also someone that practices what you preach in terms of your living on Bitcoin and whatever challenges and opportunities that proposes.
Yep, exactly. So not only have I worked in the space since 2017, that was also when I realized, if I'm going to be dedicating this much of myself to it, I need to practice what I preach. I need to, walk the talk. So I put myself and my family on a Bitcoin standard, and we've been essentially living on Bitcoin since then. Just like you said, it's not the main topic for today, but just to make sure everyone doesn't get the wrong impression from that. I cannot spend Bitcoin everywhere in my daily life. There are plenty of places out there where I need to buy something and they won't accept Bitcoin. So what it means to be on a Bitcoin standard is that I don't hold any fiat money. I still have things like, for example, credit cards, and I can use a credit card in any shop which accepts it, and then I pay that credit card off using Bitcoin. So
Mm.
essentially, I can't say I only use Bitcoin, but I can say I only hold Bitcoin.
Your final settlement is in Bitcoin once your
Always.
debts are paid on that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool. Well, let's jump right in because I'm sure this will take a bit of time. I mean, I'll open it off with a bit of a leading question. But I'm curious how you answer it. If someone comes up to you and says, "Ben, what is Bitcoin?" Where do you start? How do you begin to answer that question?
So my very first straightforward answer is that Bitcoin is a form of money. Um, that, of course, then obviously leads into questions like, well, okay, what is money? How do I understand the difference between one kind of money versus another kind of money? And that's where we have to start getting into the details. So yeah, Bitcoin is money, but specifically Bitcoin is a form of money that isn't controlled by any kind of centralized entity. So if you look at things like the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, whatever, there's always some kind of central bank behind it. There's some kind of group of people who say, we are defining what this money is. We're defining how much of this money there is. We can create more money at will. We can put money into the system. We can theoretically take it out, although they almost never do. So that's the role of a central bank. Bitcoin is a type of money which doesn't have a central bank. That, of course, then gets into the questions, well, okay, how does that work? And the simplest of analogies is to look at things like other kinds of commodity-based money. So look at things like gold, for example. There is only a certain amount of gold in the world, and you can't just magically create more of it at will when you need to have more money. The gold simply exists. That's the type of money that Bitcoin is, but Bitcoin has the advantage of being completely digital. So actually, Bitcoin is a mathematical protocol. It exists entirely as a set of mathematical principles. And because of that, you can do things with it that you can't do with physical money like gold. So that's, I think, the very, very high level overview. What is Bitcoin?
Yeah, that makes sense, and I'll try to also on my end think from my friends who who ask those questions because even myself, like you've been in Bitcoin far longer, and I think I'm having you on because I think you can explain it better than I can. But even though I've been in Bitcoin since early 2021, not that long now, I even find myself saying words, and then I'm like, let me take a step back because that word needs an explanation, or just like you did with the what is money. So for people to think about with this episode, this isn't the end all be all of understanding Bitcoin because I think people will listen to this episode and perhaps have more questions on many of the other topics, right? Kind of digging into what is money. And I think following this episode, I'll be sure to link in some other resources I think are pretty relevant from this. But you also sent over one of the points maybe we can maybe start with is the UTXO model.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to go in any order of the things you sent over and have them on my end. But if you wanted to dig into that a little bit, what is a UTXO? Why is it important in Bitcoin?
Yep, absolutely. So in Bitcoin, there are a lot of different acronyms and unusual terms that people are going to hear. And one of those quite often that people will hear is UTXO. And it sounds scary when you start throwing out all of these different strange words and acronyms. But really, UTXO is just an abbreviation. It stands for unspent transaction output. And it means pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the output of a transaction. So let's say I have some Bitcoin and I want to send it to you. I want to send you all of that Bitcoin that I have, whether that's 1,000 Satoshis, 1,000,000 Satoshis, whatever. Satoshis, by the way, are the smallest unit of Bitcoin. 1/100 millionth of a Bitcoin is a Satoshi. If I wanted to send you some amount of Bitcoin, what I will do is I will take my UTXO, my unspent transaction output, and I will perform a mathematical operation on it called signing, and then assign that to a piece of information that you have given me, which allows you to prove that you now own it. So what I'm actually doing is destroying the old UTXO and creating a new one. That may sound very abstract, especially when I talk about performing some kind of arcane mathematical operation on it, but a very good analogy of it. And remember, all analogies are just that. They're never perfect, but a very good way to think of it is imagine some boxes. Those boxes are everywhere in the world at once. They are stored on a globally distributed ledger called the blockchain or the time chain. And those boxes are the UTXOs. I have a key to open the box, and when I do, it can never be closed again. So what I do to send you a certain amount of Bitcoin is I open the box that I have a key for. I take out all of the Bitcoin that is in there. I then create one or more new boxes based on other keys. So it could be my own key, it could be your key. And I put that Bitcoin that I have taken out into those boxes. Now, that's an important distinction to the way that a lot of other money works. If I make a transaction with a lot of other systems, I may just take some of the money out and give that to you and leave the rest of it in the box. But Bitcoin doesn't work that way. You always take all of the money out of the box and you'll put some of it maybe into another box that you own and some of it into the box of the person you're sending it to. So you can think of those boxes essentially as the individual UTXOs, and the keys that we're using to open the box is the way that we define who has access to it. So when I'm going to pay you, you give me a piece of information. That information is generally in the form of a Bitcoin address, and the address is really just a way of identifying your box. You have a key, so you can generate the address from that key, and now I can put money into your box without me being able to open it again afterwards. Only you can do so. So that's the very basic idea of the UTXO model. You can imagine some more complex cases, of course, because this is all digital, because it's all mathematical. We can do clever things like have multiple keys to open a single box. So you can get into these really interesting kind of scenarios.
Yeah, as you were talking, I visualized like storage units too. In turn, because I think that was one of the things early on that I learned. I mean, once you get into like, okay, holding dollar bills and realizing, okay, what is the dollar management system, right? So with Bitcoin, everything it's all on a ledger. It's all, you have keys to access and to unlock, but it's not that you actually hold the box in your house. Like the boxes are always accessible, but it's the private key that creates the ownership. So when people say they own Bitcoin or they own sats, you own the private keys to access it, and only you can access it, or whoever can access it that has that private key. That for me was a important distinction, is separated a bit from like gold ownership, or like, having that thing on your hand. It's kind of the same thing at the end of the day. But that's an important distinction to see that it's on this public, decentralized ledger.
Absolutely. It is actually an important distinction for multiple reasons. One of them, of course, is that when people talk about having a Bitcoin wallet, let's say I have a Bitcoin wallet on my phone and I've got 100,000 sats on my phone. What that really means is that I have a private key on my phone, which is capable of accessing one of those boxes on the time chain containing 100,000 sats. And I could have the same key on a different device somewhere else, which is also capable of accessing it. So a lot of people kind of get this idea in their head, oh, I've got the Bitcoin on my phone or on a hardware wallet or on my computer. That's not true. You have the key on those things. And that distinction is really important because you can have the same key elsewhere as well. So you can have multiple devices in multiple places which have the same key on them. That's a really important distinction, because otherwise you can get into a false way of thinking, oh, I lost my phone, therefore I lost my Bitcoin. That's absolutely not true. I lost my phone, but I had my key backed up somewhere else, so no problem, I can still access my Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, I think this leads into another topic very similar to what you're talking about, which is the wild world of key management. I think that's a lot of conversation is around centralized sources, like a Coinbase or like a Cash App or something like that, where people can buy Bitcoin and it's accessible, here in the States. But you don't have access to your own private keys. And then there's other solutions. And I think people can think so many different ways about private key ownership. And is it really complicated? There are many complicated methods to do it. There's more simpler methods. Where are the trade-offs? So can we get into a little bit of key management and maybe a bit more? We touched on it a little bit, but if you want to elaborate a bit more on private keys, why a lot of Bitcoiners talk about how this is so important, and where the trade-offs are for you and how you think about these things.
Yep. So there's a well-known expression. I'm pretty sure it was Andreas Antonopoulos who said it first. And anyone who doesn't know who he is, please look him up. He's
Yeah, so I'm going to share more of his videos after. He's always he's the goat in my mind. Like I cannot think of like Ben, you are fantastic, but I think his explanations like 7 years ago on Bitcoin, he just does it in a way. So people can definitely look for that on our social channels. But
absolutely,
anyway,
he's
go ahead.
great. And I think he was the first person to say, "Not your keys, not your coins," and that's an important phrase, essentially because, as I just explained with the UTXO model, all of the Bitcoin is always there. It's on the time chain. It's distributed globally around the world. I have a Bitcoin node running on my computer, which is just over there, just across the other side of the room, and that node has everyone's Bitcoin on it. All of your Bitcoin is sitting there on my node. All of Coinbase's Bitcoin, that huge amount that company has, is all sitting on my node. I can't access it because I don't have the keys. What that really then leads to is the idea that key ownership is really control over your Bitcoin. And unfortunately, we live in a world where ownership is or access to something is essentially ownership of something. It's just one of the unfortunate consequences of the world that if somebody else is holding something on your behalf, then really you don't necessarily have complete control over it, and your ownership of it could be taken away. We see that all the time with fiat money. Somebody has got a lot of money in the bank. Then they go to a protest that the government doesn't like in their particular jurisdiction, and now they no longer have access to their money in their bank. That's exactly the same thing in Bitcoin if you don't control your own keys. So if you go to a website like Coinbase or Kraken or any of these other large exchanges, and you purchase some Bitcoin, you exchange some of your fiat money for some Bitcoin, then that Bitcoin that is there and is theoretically yours, it may be even contractually yours, depending on what the conditions are with the exchange, but you don't actually have control over that. So if this company were to close down, if they were to be compromised, somebody were to hack into their systems, then you could lose access to that Bitcoin. You could say, hey, please give me the Bitcoin that I theoretically own, and maybe they will, maybe they won't. Most of the time, under normal circumstances, they will, but there's a trust relationship going on there. Whereas once you have the Bitcoin under your own control, under your own keys, then nobody can take that away from you. The only way really would be to actually steal the keys in some way, such as, I've got it on a hardware device and somebody physically steals that device and forces their way into it. Or I've written it down on a piece of paper and put it in a safe and they, crack into my safe and steal that bit of paper. That's about the only way somebody's getting access to my keys. Whereas when it's under somebody else's control, it's a lot fuzzier, it's a lot more fluid.
This episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner is brought to you by Zeus. Zeus is a self-custodial Bitcoin wallet for Android and iOS. The app features a built-in Lightning node that allows you to take full control of how you make payments on-chain and on Lightning. You can easily onboard to the Lightning network and let Zeus's Lightning service provider, Olympus, do all the heavy lifting for you. Or you can get more hands-on and curate your own Lightning channels with whoever you transact with most. Zeus has best-in-class privacy and allows you to have great peace of mind when sending and receiving Lightning payments. Not only does the Zeus team not want to know how you're using your money, but they're building things in a way that they can't know. There's also a first-of-its-kind Lightning address that will allow you to receive payments 24/7 to your mobile wallet self-custodially. This is a great solution for a range of people. For those who just want to have the technical ability to set up their own infrastructure, to nomads and dissidents that need to accept donations on the move. Other Lightning wallets don't give the users this level of control. In fact, many of them operate more like bank accounts that can be revoked and ultimately lead to you losing your money. With Zeus, you're in full control of your private keys and therefore can start to take full control of your financial destiny. To learn more and to learn where to download, head to ZeusLN.com. So in terms of keys, can we talk a little bit about backups and what that looks like? Because keys accessing Bitcoin, there's a number of different ways that you or you can elect others or multi-sig situations or all of these things. Maybe just a couple examples. A lot of people think of for those, once you get into Bitcoin, you hear a little bit about, seed phrases and kind of what I consider like backup words, right? Like kind of these set of words that If you lose your Bitcoin hardware wallet or lose your phone or whatever, and need to transition to a different app or a different way of accessing that Bitcoin that, as you said, is there, just needs the key to access it. You have these words that if you enter in, that unlocks your access to Bitcoin. That is the key. So
Yeah.
can you talk about some of what those backup looks like? Because when people hear keys, they're like, okay, well, like, what does that look like?
Yep, absolutely. So here's actually something perhaps important to understand first, that a lot of people, even people have been around Bitcoin for quite a while. Something that not a lot of people realize: you don't always need the same type of key to access one of these UTXOs, one of these locked boxes on the chain. The boxes are locked according to what are known as spending conditions, and those spending conditions can be a wide variety of different things. You could even have a UTXO which says the spending condition is that the block number is higher than 83,000, which means in about what are we, 82,000, 820,000. I mean, they just 30,000.
Yeah. I was like 83.
Right now.
Went back in time.
Yeah, in about 2.5. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, in about 2,500 blocks, that would just be accessible to anyone because that's what the spending condition said. So the spending conditions are what's important. And most of the time, the spending condition is simply, I can prove that I have access to this particular address using a private key. And what that private key really is a mathematical number. So it's a number which you have generated, and then you can derive other numbers from it using some mathematical principles. It probably isn't worth it to go into all of the cryptography here as to how that works, but to give a really simple example of a one-way mathematical function, which is the type of things these are, it's very, very easy to multiply two prime numbers together. So if I said to you, what's 17 times, it's another prime number, 7. You could work that out very quickly. But if I gave you the product of those two numbers and told you, tell me the two prime factors of that, the only way you can actually figure that out is to go through and guess. So you try a bunch of different prime factors until you find the right ones. Now imagine I had a couple of prime numbers which are 100 digits long each, and I multiply them together, and I give you the product of those two numbers. Trying to find the two prime factors of that is a Herculean task, even for a computer, because there is no known way to figure it out other than to simply try it. Now, Bitcoin doesn't actually use that particular type of one-way function. It uses different things. ECDSA, the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, is kind of a standard. But the idea of a one-way function is that I can have a private key and generate a public key from it. So the public key is that product, and I can give that to anyone. And the public key helps you generate an address. So from the private key, I generate a public key. From the public key, I generate an address. And now I can say, okay, I give that address out to anyone. They have no idea what my private key is, but I can very easily use my private key to prove that I can not only generate that address, but do it in such a way that I can say, I will be able to access the Bitcoin that was now sent to that address because I have the mathematical proof for that. So that's the idea of a key from a mathematical point of view. What that then means is I have a number. At the end of the day, a number. How do I secure that number? I could secure it by writing down this very long number, and maybe I'll make a mistake, and then when I want to enter it into another device, there's going to be issues. So instead, we have a bunch of different methods. There's one very common standard, though, where you convert that long number into a bunch of words. Those words are guaranteed unique. It could be 12 words. It could be 24 words. There are actually other standards as well, but you'll almost always see 12 or 24 from pretty much any piece of software or hardware that you're going to deal with. And those words can be translated by a computer back into that number. So that's what the backup kind of looks like. And that's the most basic form of backing something up. Obviously, anyone who gets access to those words can now regenerate the same thing. And so because of that, there are other security things. You mentioned the idea of multi-sig, for example. So I can have one of these locked boxes on the chain, which actually takes multiple keys. So instead of only one key, I now have to enter 3 keys to open it. Or maybe there are actually 5 locks on it, but I can enter any of 3 of those 5 in order to open it. And that would be called a 3 of 5 multi-signature. So there were 5 keys used, or 5 locks used to lock it, but I only need any 3 of them in order to open it. There are some issues with that. Using multi-sig, you do need to know the public key for all of the 5 private keys, not just the 3 that you're using to open it. So there are caveats, and this is where I really say, if you're going to do something like that, you need to understand it yourself before you actually just dive in and do it, because there definitely are people who have lost access to their Bitcoin by doing multi-sig the wrong way. So yeah, I highly recommend people actually look into it and understand it before using something like that. There are other ways, by the way, of splitting a key up as well. There's something called Shamir secret sharing, which I personally am quite a fan of. I think it's a very interesting technology. Again, it has its own limitations, and you have to understand it before you necessarily dive in and use it. But what Shamir does is it takes a single key and breaks it up into multiple parts that you then restore, for example, using 3 of 5, or even much larger numbers, 8 of 15 or whatever. And that way, when you restore it again, you now have a single key. So on the time chain, it's still just one lock with one key, but you've broken it up into multiple parts, so you can store it in different locations and have a much more robust anti-theft kind of thing. Somebody breaks into my house and steals one of those parts, they don't necessarily have enough information to reconstitute the key and access my Bitcoin.
Now, what that looks like on a practical, I want to ask and just clarify, because it's been a little bit since I looked into it. So that on a very practical end looks like different sets of seed phrase backups, right? Different sets of words. Let's imagine you have them on pieces of paper. So, you have 5 pieces of paper with 12 or 24 words on each paper. That's kind of the password to unlock. If you have 3 of 5 of those sets of pieces of paper, then you can unlock that box. That's what you're describing, right?
Exactly. So one of the advantages, though, with multi-sig compared to Shamir, so I just mentioned I really like this Shamir secret sharing system. One of the advantages of a traditional multi-sig instead is that I don't need to bring all the pieces together to do it. So what that means is I could have multiple people who only need to collaborate with each other, but never actually need to bring their keys together. So let's say we had a 2 of 3 multi-sig, you, me, and somebody else. And any 2 of us can collaborate to spend that Bitcoin. I could create a new transaction and sign it with my key, and then give you this partially signed transaction. And this is another one of those acronyms that you'll occasionally hear in Bitcoin, a PSBT, partially signed Bitcoin transaction. I will give that to you. You will sign it with your key, and then we broadcast that to the network. So what we've done is, without ever bringing our keys together, we've collaborated on signing a transaction. And this is actually where some companies are offering services which are quite interesting for people who have maybe a large amount of Bitcoin and aren't necessarily going to trust themselves even to have complete control over all of it. What you do is you work with a company who will hold one signing key. You hold 2 keys in a 2 of 3 kind of arrangement. Maybe one is inside a particular app, and now and one is a backup key that you keep completely separate. So now whenever you want to create a normal transaction, you sign it from your side, the company signs it from their side, and the transaction is made. But if that company were to ever go out of business, you can still access your own Bitcoin by going to that backup key, and now you've got the key that you have plus the backup key working together in order to sign the transaction. So there are these kinds of arrangements that can be done with multi-sig, which are really, quite interesting approaches. Something I probably should have mentioned earlier, I kind of glossed over it a bit, is that the private key itself, that long mathematical number, isn't actually a direct representation of those backup words that you've written down. The backup words that you write down from almost every standard system, the standard way of doing this, is that they are actually a seed number which can generate any potentially large number of private keys. So you start off with a seed, and then you generate private key from the seed, and then you generate public key from the private key, and then you generate address from the public key. So it's kind of this long chain. But the reason that that's important is that private keys alone are actually not enough to re-access your Bitcoin. You need, well, I should say the seed word alone is not enough, because seed words could generate any potentially huge number, millions, trillions, close to infinite amount of keys, private keys. What you actually need in addition to the seed is some kind of derivation path. So they're hierarchically deterministic wallets. Occasionally you'll see the phrase written as HD wallets, or you'll hear the term hierarchical determinism. You don't really need to understand how it works if you're sort of new to Bitcoin, if this is, you're just looking at the basics, but you do need to know that that information is needed, this derivation path in addition to the seed. For that reason, a lot of newer wallets are actually using what are called descriptors, which is basically, realistically, in the simplest case, it's just the seed data plus the derivation path in one simple package, so that this descriptor really is all you need to access your Bitcoin. Of course, descriptors can then be more complex, such as multi-sig or other special spending conditions, like I mentioned earlier.
So let's say, and again, if people are hearing this and you're confused, I'd say the best thing to kind of understand is that it's going to take time and research to look into these things. You don't have to understand all of these things to use Bitcoin, to be a Bitcoiner, to advocate for Bitcoin, to hold your private keys, things like that. But the one thing that's clear through this is that Bitcoin is an incredibly secure network. I think that's the point through all of this. Like, you will always continue to learn new things about Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is like your sweatshirt that you're wearing. Cypherpunk future is now. Like, Bitcoin was created by cypherpunks on a rich history of e-cash, cryptography, all of these other things. There's going to continuously be new methods of using and working with Bitcoin. It'll be a never-ending development. Granted, it's a more conservative development approach than other crypto projects that, in my opinion, quite honestly, will just say things to make it sound like something very cool or secure is going on in the background, when really it's maybe just a central server, and all these projects aren't the same. But the biggest thing, if you're confused by what Ben's saying, understanding that all of this, the things we're stressing here, is security, security, security. That is one of the strongest things about Bitcoin in terms of the best monetary chain, ledger, all of that. But I wanted to back up for a second and just ask about, so let's say someone hears this and they're like, oh, I have my seed phrase. So wait, if I lose my wallet or something, you're saying that alone, I won't be able to access it with, Bitbox, one of our sponsors, let's say Bitbox, or, any other hardware wallet. They've got a Trezor, they've got a Ledger, whatever. And if they wanted to access their Bitcoin, let's say that company goes out of business, whatever the company I just mentioned goes out of business, but they have the seed phrase. What's a way that they can access their private keys? Because I can imagine someone hearing that and being like, oh, I have my seed phrase. What else do I need right now in this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of the good things with these derivation paths is they are actually relatively standardized. So it's not entirely the case that if you only have your seed phrase, you will never access your Bitcoin again, because there's a very good chance that you're going to be able to guess what the derivation path was. When you set up your brand new Bitbox, when you set up your brand new device from whichever manufacturer, or new software wallet on your phone or whatever, there will be a default derivation path. And chances are you selected that either without even realizing or without even seeing it. Maybe it was hidden behind some kind of advanced option and you just clicked straight past it. No problem. That default derivation path tends to be very well known. So it's very easy to go online and just, you could Google literally, what is the default derivation path for Bitcoin on a Bitbox? And you would get the answer. So then importing it into a new wallet would be no problem. Or just go out, buy another Bitbox and enter the seed phrase, keep it on the default, and you should have access to your Bitcoin, because they shouldn't be just changing the derivation path from one version to the next. So even though I'm a big fan of saying you should be using the newer descriptor model because it contains all that information, you don't need to be too scared that if all you've got is your seed words that you're definitely going to lose all your Bitcoin. That's not the case.
Yeah, and all of these typically, I don't know for a fact, but a lot of these companies will even describe even multi-sig different companies that are doing those type of services and stuff, and people can look into the trade-offs and models. Typically, they'll describe or kind of you mentioned kind of packets. Some of them will literally have a downloadable, in addition to your seed phrase, that 12 password. Will also say this is your derivation path. This, they'll actually describe like if we go out of business tomorrow, this is the full information you'll need. I personally would say a good company
Yeah.
puts that out there to make it as clear as possible, saying if we're not here tomorrow, this is how you'll still be able to fully 100% access your Bitcoin. But even without that, there's so many different ways that different wallet makers, different key services, things like this will assist with that. And I think the ecosystem is pretty good about putting that out there, in addition to trying to make profits and the business model, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it actually reflects back to something you were just saying before. You don't need to understand all of this technical stuff I'm talking about in order to use Bitcoin. And it's kind of about security, but it's actually also about the way that Bitcoin works without having any kind of central management. So there is no Bitcoin, the company. There is no group of people who decide this is how Bitcoin works. We are running the Bitcoin network. If something goes wrong, you pick up the phone and you call a Bitcoin representative. That's not the way any of this works. And in order for it to work as a completely decentralized system where everybody has equal rights on the network, it needs to have these cryptographic principles in order to build a system like that. So while it's relatively complex under the hood, all you really need to understand is this idea that I have access to my Bitcoin through my private keys. It could be just me, or it could be me collaborating with some other private keys. The absolute basics of what I mentioned about that UTXO model. So I take everything out of one box and I split it into one or more. That's important when we start talking about things like transaction fees, which we haven't yet, but maybe later on this call, or maybe you can talk about that with another guest. And it's a relatively simple thing to use. It's a relatively complex thing when you want to look at all of the different possible use cases, all of the different possible ways that you could store and access your money. And quite simply, the reason for that is there is no central entity. There's nobody who said, these are the way, or this is the absolute way that you write down this number of words in order to create your keys. Quite simply, or create your seed phrase. That's quite simply one way that somebody said, this would be a good way to do it. And a bunch of other people said, yeah, we agree, let's do it that way. But occasionally somebody else comes along and says, I've got a different way of doing it. I've got my preferred way. It's a very, very powerful wallet, both on the computer and on mobile devices, called Electrum. Electrum can use the standard seed phrases that are generated by pretty much every other wallet, but it generates a completely different form, which the people who created Electrum think is better in quite a few ways. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not right, but that's, everyone has free to their own opinion and their own way of doing things. So Electrum generates a completely different type of seed phrase than the seed phrase that we're using, for example, from the Bitbox.
One of my favorite things about Bitcoin too is it's completely opt-in, and it's giving you complete control. It's your choice how you engage with the network, how you use Bitcoin. This is a separate conversation, but what you put onto the Bitcoin network and how you interact with Bitcoin, people might define Bitcoin differently in terms of what it is, because it's software, it's open source software, pretty simple at the base layer. So people can use it in different and interesting ways. But what I love is, I think in terms of, there's a bit of a hierarchy as well in terms of self-sovereignty with Bitcoin. Now down to the wire of like generating your own, keys, doing all of these different super complex things for users that are interested in that. To the very top layer, I would argue, is perhaps something like a Bitcoin ETF. Now, again, there's a big difference between private keys and Bitcoin ETF that I don't think would take too long for someone to understand. But a Bitcoin ETF is just following price action, right? So you might say, okay, I see that Bitcoin is going up in price. I have this retirement account and I'd like to benefit from that price action. but you're holding an ETF, which is based on dollars, tracking the Bitcoin price. So that's that's the most loosely attached to Bitcoin that you could get on this spectrum. And then below that is probably buying something, buying Bitcoin on Coinbase and having it held on Coinbase with their private keys. And then you go on down. So people can interact, like my personal opinion is people can interact with Bitcoin on the level that they prefer. And I have a strong belief that, because when I first got into Bitcoin, I bought on Coinbase. And then I quickly, though, I've said it on this pod before, not got in my head, but I was like, ooh, I want to try to hold this the most secure way possible. Because I started to understand the properties of like, oh, I can actually hold this. It isn't an IOU on something. It's something you can actually hold. And no one has to own it but me in terms of access. And I got excited about that. And I am not technical at all. I learned some technical things because I wanted to hold it, in my view, properly so that I felt secure in that. That's what's really cool about Bitcoin. And I think too many Bitcoiners get concerned that people will just stop right at that first step. I tend to give people a little more credit and say, actually, if they start to understand Bitcoin, they'll want to hold it more securely and want to hold it in a way that is more trusted, especially people in the global south, right? That have actually seen crumbling infrastructure, that do not trust their banks, all of this. Us in the US and the West, we've got it pretty good, but we've also seen some bank runs and seen some other stuff happen that have caused people to think, how can I hold this securely, right? Things like that. So Bitcoin being opt-in, there's so many different cool ways and only increasing more and more ways to interact with Bitcoin, to hold Bitcoin, all of this. It's really user's choice. And that's very, very cool, no matter where you're at. So if you're not super technical or super comfortable, like don't jump right into a multi-sig complicated situation and then lose access to your Bitcoin. Like start off simple. That is totally okay in my book.
Exactly. I would also add to that, if you start going down the rabbit hole of what's the most secure way I could hold this, I did that as a thought experiment a little while ago, and I was thinking
gosh, that sounds like something Lop would do as well.
I was thinking about what does it actually mean for a wallet to be more secure or less secure? Or in Bitcoin terms, we often talk about hot wallet and cold wallet as if it's some kind of binary dichotomy, where a hot wallet is one where your keys are online and therefore theoretically accessible, and a cold wallet is one where your keys are detached from the network in some way. And what I was actually thinking about was the network itself is irrelevant because Bitcoin is a mathematical protocol. It's implemented on the internet, but Bitcoin itself is not an internet protocol. Bitcoin is a mathematical protocol being implemented on the internet. And what that really means is that the distinction between hot and cold is actually kind of fuzzier. What you've really got is how easy is it to access the Bitcoin from outside of the intended process. And this is kind of this weird fuzzy sounding thing, but the intended, if I were to take my seed words and write them on a huge piece of paper and nail that to a tree in a public park, technically it's still a cold wallet because my wallet was never connected to the internet. But realistically, it's incredibly easy for anyone to come along, write down those seed words and gain access to my Bitcoin. So obviously how hot or cold a wallet is actually depends on ease of access. So, doing this kind of thought experiment, I was like, well, okay, maybe the absolute coldest wallet you could get, the one which is hardest to access, would be that I beam my Bitcoin as pulses of light into a black hole, and now you wait for Hawking radiation to slowly evaporate that black hole over 10 to the 100 years or something, and finally you'll be able to hopefully reconstruct a private key out of that. So it's a ridiculous scenario, but really that's just kind of going to show when you're thinking about hot versus cold, you actually don't really have a most secure. You just have different kinds of secure in different ways with different trade-offs. So thinking about, for example, those multi-sig scenarios where there's a third-party company holding one key and the application holding one key and you having a backup, so you use the application, they will co-sign it. If that application is written by that same company, could they not just issue an update to the application which steals the application key? Now they have 2 of the 3 keys to access your Bitcoin and could steal it. So there is actually these kinds of things that you think about and you go, oh, actually, security is hard. Security is complex, and you're never going to find the perfect security. All you're going to find is what are the trade-offs of this form of security versus this other form of security. The
Yeah.
perfect security is Bitcoin that you can't access, and that's not useful. You need to be able to access your own Bitcoin at some point.
Yeah, and there's always and again, especially if you look on social media or anything like that, it's always extremes, right? And so you'll have people saying this is the best and most secure way, or this is or no, if you do that, that's the worst, right? I think emphasizing, and I've seen more and more people do this, which is good. Like the trade offs, and it depends on your individual situation and circumstances. Like how safe is your home environment? Are you more transient? Are you on the move? Like what is your level of comfort with technology or with for some I would say if you are, I'd prefer me personally. I prefer someone to deal with some multi-sig company like you're describing, rather than do something they're not super comfortable with and lose access, right? Because the whole point is, what is that trade-off with having access but being comfortably secure, rather than full security but more likely to lose access, which means it's actually not full security. Like you and I think are very comfortable talking in the philosophical sense versus the truly technical sense of, okay, technically this element might be most secure, but in actuality it's not, because okay, in 25% of cases they will lose this key. So I think people need to, everything about Bitcoin too is like a lot of individual choice. You need to think for yourself about what is best for your situation. And I would also say, if your Bitcoin is on Coinbase or you're holding it somewhere, I would not say you need to like jump off this call right now and do anything drastic. Like, some Bitcoiners might disagree, but still, like, even if Bitcoin is lost in the situations, depending on your nation, I will say that. But in the U.S., we do have laws, we do have theft laws, we do have courts. It might take time for you to recover your Bitcoin in certain situations. You have to deal with companies and insurance and all of these different things. You may not ever get that Bitcoin back. That is a risk, but I wouldn't be too alarmist about it. But for people to start thinking, okay, what are some ways I can diversify my setup? Maybe I have some Bitcoin there. Maybe I have some Bitcoin in this forced retirement account I have to have. So, okay, it's, connection to Bitcoin price action through the ETF. But you know what? I'm going to start experimenting with this more private, secure element with some low amounts of Bitcoin, some really small ones. I'll send it back and forth. I'll play around with that, see how comfortable I am. I'll wipe the wallet, try to recover it with a seed phrase. That's the way to do it, is to play around with really small amounts. You might get burned a little bit. For me, that's how I learned. I got burnt a little bit on very, very small amounts. I'm like, ooh, okay, I know what I did there. If you really care about it, play around with it and get to know it. But you don't need to rush into anything extreme in the moment, right? Like in my opinion, our country is not defaulting tomorrow in the United States. In some places, there might be more dire consequences. So I think that you have to evaluate all of that. Long story short.
Exactly. Everyone's situation is unique, even within one particular country or economy.
Mm-hmm.
For
Yep.
some people in the United States, for example, it's going to be very easy to take a small amount of Bitcoin and transfer it between a few different wallets and that sort of thing. For other people, though, that may be actually a difficult thing from a transaction fee perspective. It may be a difficult
Mm-hmm.
thing from the cost of purchasing a hardware wallet to try it out if they are going to try that kind of thing. If they want to do multi-sig and they heard somebody say, well, it's good to have different hardware manufacturers so you're not tied to one particular hardware attack.
Mm-hmm.
That, or there can be financially prohibitive things going on there as well. So it is, everyone's situation is unique, and everyone should try to evaluate for themselves what's best. Just to plug my own services very slightly here, as
Mm-hmm.
an independent consultant, this is something I help people do. So anyone who's really interested in that sort of thing, I encourage them to reach out to a consultant, whether it be me or somebody else. If that's something which is, again, something you can afford, because of course, also not only a hardware wallet's not free, consultants aren't free either. But there is plenty of free information out there online. And I'm sure this series you're doing on the Progressive Bitcoiner here, is going to help a lot of people at no cost. So, I think that's a wonderful service as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. There's multiple different entry points, no matter those price things like that. Gosh, I've got so many other questions that we could talk about. I think a couple of more points I definitely want to make sure to focus on in this episode. One being, maybe answer it philosophically, and I want to then we can shift into fees, Lightning Network, that sort
Yep.
of thing.
Yep.
But from your perspective, because a lot of people ask when they first see Bitcoin, okay, it's magic internet money. Okay, maybe now at this point, some they'd understand, okay, keys, like this ledger, accessing boxes. Okay, I can see the mathematical mechanisms. But from your perspective, why is Bitcoin valuable? Like, where does Bitcoin derive its value from? Some people might say, in an old frame of thinking, what is it backed by? All of this. So when someone asks that question, like, well, it's worthless, say someone on the opposite end, if they're listening to the show, they probably don't think it's worthless, probably a little bit curious.
Yep.
Someone said, so where does Bitcoin derive its value from? Can we go into that a little bit?
Value. So this is getting into some sort of deeper philosophical questions here, but you have to then ask, what is value? Value is what I personally choose to consider something I want to have. So value is a subjective thing in the mind of an individual. If I'm crawling through a desert and I haven't had anything to drink in a long time, I will value a bottle of water very, very highly. Whereas if I'm just hanging out in my house, sure, I value a bottle of water. It's a nice thing to have, but it's it's nowhere near as critical to me at that point. So its value isn't as high. When we talk about the value of things, what we're normally talking about is intersubjective value. So rather than it just being my subjective value, it's my subjective value and your subjective value together, so that we can have some idea of being able to trade things between us. So, maybe, the classic old example of trade, I have 2 goats, you have 1 cow. We both agree that you would like to have 2 goats and I would like to have 1 cow. So we value those either roughly the same, or maybe I value a cow slightly higher than 2 goats and you value 2 goats slightly higher than 1 cow. So we both feel like we had a good trade when we swap those things. So that's what value is. Now that gets back to that very original question, what is money? Money is a way to represent value without having a specific objective property that is valued outside of the value itself. So I value water because I can drink it. I value a cow because it can give me milk, I can eat its beef, whatever the different reasons you value a cow are. I don't value money for anything other than the fact that other people also value it. Money to me, whether it's euro, dollars, Bitcoin, all of them are valueless if nobody else wants them from me. Sure. So money is the representation of value without having its own inherent value. And I'm always careful with terms like inherent value as well. I actually consider the term quite meaningless. What I really mean when I say inherent value is inherent properties that give it value. So give a value to individuals. So Bitcoin is money. Therefore, the reason it has value is because it's money and other people also want to have it. Then you get to the question, okay, why? Why do other people want to have it? Why does anyone want to have Bitcoin compared to other kinds of money? So then you get into something called the properties of money. Money is good at being money when it has certain properties. It's bad at being money when it doesn't have these properties. So to give a really simple example, divisibility. Let's say I have a small 1 gram piece of gold. Right now, I think that's worth a little bit over $50 US. I'm not actually really sure. I never look at the gold price that much, but let's call it $50 US. If I wanted to go and buy a candy bar with this 1 gram piece of gold, that would be difficult because it's quite hard to take this 1 gram piece of gold and shave off just enough of it to have the exact right amount of weight in order to buy a candy bar. So the divisibility of gold is relatively poor when you get to small values. That could be, you can even imagine other scenarios where you've got houses. We're going to use houses as money from now on. Well, if I'm going to buy a candy bar, how do I do that? Do I buy 100 million candy bars for this house and then swap, then start giving out candy bars to other people? So divisibility is important. Other properties that make money important are things like verifiability. So you can verify that it is what it says it is. With a dollar bill, for example, How easy is it to fake a dollar bill? Well, it's got all these nice little security mechanisms in it, so it's relatively difficult, but you still can. How easy is it to fake a gold bar? Well, relatively easy to fake something that looks like a gold bar, but then you can maybe, do different tests on it, like the weight of it. You can melt it down to see if there was any other material hidden inside it of a similar density. All these kinds of things let you verify that gold is actually gold. So different properties exist on money. Bitcoin, in most of the properties that you can think of, as far as money is concerned, is quite simply a better form of money. It is more divisible than most other forms of money. It's incredibly verifiable because of this entire UTXO model, with the time chain being distributed all over the world. And we haven't talked about the mining process at all, but that also helps ensure the verifiability of the Bitcoin. There is the idea of scarcity. So something else we haven't mentioned yet is that Bitcoin is limited in the amount of Bitcoin that can exist. So if I have, we'll go back to that water example. If there's a lot of water available, water isn't that valuable. If there's only a very small amount available, then all of a sudden water becomes incredibly valuable to me. The scarcity of something, and it doesn't even matter exactly what those values are, simply is it a scarce resource or not? Is it limited in supply? Makes it more valuable than something which is unlimited in supply. US dollars are a really good example of that. Recently, the Federal Reserve has been printing a huge amount of dollars over the last year or two. There's been more money. I don't remember the exact figures, but over the last 6 months, there was something like more money printed than there was ever printed before that, or some insane figure like that, some insane concept like that. And that shows that dollars themselves are not scarce, and therefore the value of dollars can go down. There's more dollars into the economy, the value of each individual dollar goes down, unless you're increasing the total value of the economy to match, which clearly isn't happening. So a fixed supply really helps with that. And there's a bunch of other properties. I don't think it's useful to necessarily go through all of them. There's some great articles online about that sort of thing. But talking about the properties of money, Bitcoin quite simply has better grades, better marks in every property you can think of, with perhaps the exception of acceptance, in that Bitcoin is not as well accepted around the world as several other currencies. So Bitcoin is actually more accepted than some very small currencies. Bitcoin is far more accepted, for example, than the Tongan Pa'anga, the currency of the Kingdom of Tonga in the South Pacific. You will find more people in the world willing to accept Bitcoin from you than Tongan Pa'anga. So Bitcoin isn't the worst in terms of acceptability, but you'll definitely find more people willing to take US dollars from you than you will Bitcoin right now.
Yeah. And I think that's a place that a lot of Bitcoiners would agree on, or really advocates of Bitcoin, and those that start to understand, many would argue that Bitcoin is the best form of money for those things. So there's articles that delve more into that, but I think that's a great way to put it. There's that subjective value of, if no one wanted to use Bitcoin, okay, like Bitcoin isn't a guaranteed success story. Like people have to want to be interested in holding it, spending it, using it, all of that sort of thing. So there has to be interest in it. But then there's these more objective, I know for someone like you especially would cringe at these words, which I love. Just that value, that what are the properties that make people interested in it. I think that was a really good summary of that. But you touched on, I do want to touch on a little bit, because we could go further, and I'll probably do other episodes that delve more into the weeds on mining. We've talked about Bitcoin mining on here from the vantage point of climate change in the environment, and how it actually could be beneficial for renewable expansion, capturing methane, and how the benefit of Bitcoin in capturing, stranded energy and monetizing that. So it's actually a way to expand these things and do a really good job of that. So we've talked about kind of the mining element in that way. But in terms of taking a few minutes here to talk about the process of mining, what people talk about with proof of work versus proof of stake, I think people would be very interested in hearing about that, and understanding that a little bit more. And then the last thing I'd want us to touch on is maybe kind of Lightning and the other reasons for layer twos in this fee environment and growing fee environment.
Yep. Absolutely. So mining. The term mining was created in order to give you a comparison to precious metal mining. And there are
Mhm.
definitely some similarities, but there are also a lot of differences. So I'm always
Can I
quite,
say really quick that the more I think about it, the more upset I get that we really captured that. That's my personal opinion that
yeah,
that mining took off because it's more of a computation data center. So for me, mining, I'm like, ah, I think that created a lot of the FUD, but they would have found other reasons for
yeah,
FUD, so
of course they
probably
would.
not.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of bad terminology in Bitcoin. You know, the term wallet is
Mm,
bad. The term mining is bad. Even the term
mhm.
transaction is bad. And I can briefly mention why on that one because it's kind of relevant to this point here.
Sure.
One Bitcoin transaction can contain many real world transactions.
Mhm,
So I mentioned, a transaction really was opening the box, taking all the money out, and then putting it in one or more boxes. One or
mhm,
more is very much the key there. And even I could have opened multiple boxes, taken all the money out, and then put those in multiple other boxes. So a Bitcoin transaction is really just a record being written into the time chain. And that record can be zero real world transactions or could be hundreds of real world transactions.
mhm,
Or, as we'll talk about soon with Lightning, could even be the opening or closing state of potentially unlimited number of transactions that happened in between. Um, but okay, so what mining is, I mentioned with this UTXO model that I have a key to open a box, and then I put the money in your box, and now you have a key to open that box. Where did that process start? At some point, the Bitcoin had to be in a box. Um, who decided that and how? That's
mhm,
what mining does. So, right at the very start of Bitcoin, every time a new block was created, um, it would contain 50 Bitcoin in a brand new box. So, the person who creates that block or mines that block is able to put 50 Bitcoin into a new box. And they have the key to that box, so they can do whatever they want with it. 210,000 blocks later, which is approximately 4 years, um, that amount halved to 25 Bitcoin. Then it halved again in 210,000 blocks down to 12.5 Bitcoin. And anyone who can picture this on a mathematical curve is going to see that this is a approaching a limit um, kind of function. And we're getting in the very first 4 years of Bitcoin, half of the Bitcoin that will ever exist had been mined. In the next 4 years, it was 75%. In the next 4 years, it was 87.5%. So the amount of Bitcoin that gets put into a new box every block is halved, and that approaches that fixed limit of 21 million that we mentioned. So this is where that number comes from. It's actually a tiny bit under 21 million Bitcoin. Another way to put that is 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis, because sats are actually the fundamental unit of Bitcoin. The Bitcoin unit is just a abstraction, doesn't really exist. So you could actually say the first blocks had 5 billion sats, then the next time it was 2.5 billion, and so on. So that's the mining process for starting the UTXOs. But that's that. What that explains is why the miners want to do it. So why are the miners doing this to begin with? Well, they get Bitcoin out of it. If you mine a block, you get some new Bitcoin, which is great if you're a miner. And what are they exactly doing and why? So what they're doing is producing a block to be written onto this global ledger, onto this chain of a whole bunch of new UTXOs. A block isn't just one UTXO; it's a whole bunch of them, and it's size limited by the data size, not by the amount of Bitcoin that's in there. So we could be transferring all of the Bitcoin in existence. We could be transferring a tiny amount of Bitcoin. It doesn't matter. One block simply contains a certain amount of data, and it gets written to the chain. Um, any miner can write a new block to the chain. There is no rules about who can do it or when or how. The only rule is that it has to contain a certain cryptographic hash value. That hash value has to be a very specific number or below. Now, there's one of these mathematical cute cryptography tricks here. You cannot know in advance what the hash value of any particular piece of data is going to look like. So I could take a single document that I've written and compute a hash from it, and I'm going to get a certain number. I change one character in that document, compute the hash, I will get a completely different number. It could be much larger, it could be much smaller. You have absolutely no way of knowing before you compute the hash what it's going to be. So by requiring that this hash is much, much smaller than a particular value, you can see that if I am a miner and I put together a bunch of transactions and I create a new candidate block, it's called, so a new potential block, and then I create the hash of it, and I look at that hash and I say, is this bigger or smaller than the number I'm allowed to be, so the target value? Oh, it's bigger. Okay, I'm going to have to change something in the block and then compute a new hash. Generally, the thing that they change is this kind of meaningless number called the nonce, but they could actually change anything. You could take a transaction out, you could put a different transaction in, you could change the timestamp on it. It doesn't actually matter, but it's just easier and faster to change this meaningless number. So you change this meaningless number called the nonce, and you compute it again. And it's still not small enough. So you do it again and again. And you do it trillions of times until, oh, look, I finally found one under the value. And now I will broadcast it to the network. And every other node on the network can look at it and say, is this block valid? Are all the transactions in it valid? Does it contain the hash of the previous block as well? So I know that it's linking on from the previous block. That's why it's a chain. It's a time chain or a blockchain. And importantly, is this is the hash value of this block under the target for the difficulty? And the answer is yes. Okay, this is a valid block. I will now accept this as valid. And every miner will now try and build their blocks on top of this new one because this is the latest, newest block. This makes you kind of think, well, okay, I'm doing this trillions of times. It looks like we're kind of wasting energy here in order to compute these hashes. But what that actually does is it ensures that you cannot rewrite a previous block without changing every block after it. So if I said, oh, look, there's a block 5 blocks ago which contained a transaction that I'd rather that one didn't happen. I want to just steal my money back. I sent Trey some money, and I don't want to have sent him that money anymore, so I'm going to claw it back by rewriting the blockchain. What I would have to do is not only recompute that block, but I'd have to recompute every block after it, because now by taking that transaction out, I've changed what the hash of it would be, and I need to recompute a new hash. And because every block contains the hash of the previous block, I now need to recompute every block after it. In order to do that faster than the rest of the world is generating blocks, I'm going to have to spend more energy than the rest of the world in order to compute that, which is unrealistic, essentially. So I can't change historical blocks because the rest of the world is still spending energy. All of this is great, but now you think, well, okay, what happens if a whole bunch of new miners come along and now we can find blocks much faster, much quicker. I've invented some new mining technology, or I've put a whole bunch of new mining hardware onto the network. So, I can just compute blocks faster. As soon as that happens, you've got this really interesting thing called the difficulty adjustment. So every 2016 blocks, every node looks at all of the previous blocks and says, how long did it take for that to happen? Was it 10 minutes? Was it slower than 10 minutes, or was it faster than 10 minutes? If it was faster than 10 minutes, then the difficulty will increase. That is, the number, your target number that you have to reach for this hash value gets smaller, so it's harder to reach it. If it was longer than 10 minutes, it gets easier, so the target number goes up a little bit. By adjusting this difficulty number, you can ensure that blocks always come on average every 10 minutes, regardless of how much computing power is on the network. That makes it more and more difficult for anyone to go back and change historical things, quite simply because the amount of computing power no longer matters. What matters is, do you have more than everyone else combined? And the answer is, of course, no, you don't. So that's what makes Bitcoin's history essentially immutable without having anyone centralized dictating what it is. That's the proof of work system, and it's a stroke of genius, especially with the difficulty adjustment. If you have proof of work without the difficulty adjustment, then more power can come along and change history. With the difficulty adjustment, that becomes impossible. Now, a lot of people started saying, okay, proof of work, interesting system, very secure, but surely this is a huge waste of energy. This is terrible for the environment. This is, burning up all the fossil fuels. We're going to boil the oceans, all this kind of ridiculous stuff that has been said in the past. But it seems like a valid criticism at first glance. And I think probably there are better episodes to talk about why some of those criticisms are false. I think you've probably already had quite a few specialists on to talk about that stuff, which is great. But because of that, a few other people proposed other methods for doing security on the network. So instead of proof of work, for example, there's an idea called proof of stake. Proof of stake is where I, as a large holder of the tokens on this network, say, I'm going to stake my tokens. I'm going to put them up and say, if I lie about this, take my tokens away from me because I'm a horrible lying person. And now I stake my tokens and I get to essentially vote, or in some cases am elected to say what is the next valid block. And it keeps me honest because I don't want to lose my money. But really what you actually end up with in a proof of stake environment is that the rich get richer. Simply by holding a lot of money, I now earn the rewards from new blocks. And there is no historical security in proof of stake. So if I have enough stake, or if I have enough power over the network, enough ability to change the network, I could theoretically go back and change a whole bunch of previous blocks and simply in those blocks make it look like I had the most stake and was therefore able to make that vote. So proof of stake is inherently far, far less secure than proof of work. And the main reason is that it's tied to something internal to itself rather than something external. So if you notice, what Bitcoin is really tied to is the energy that was put into it. And it's
like computational power. Right.
Yeah, mathematically secured through that difficulty number. So the energy is simply being proxied into that mathematical representation. But energy is a fundamental property of the universe. Stake in a network is only a fundamental property of the network itself. So so proof of stake is inherently gameable because of that. You can cheat it because it's entirely within the system. The only way to cheat proof of work would be to invent an infinite energy machine. And if we can do that, we don't need money anymore. So problem solved.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, I think we'll do other episodes in the future too. I mean, we've done it here and there of debunking some FUD on energy, but I also think it would be cool to do an episode at some point that's really getting into, because the one thing I want to make clear too is that no system is perfect. There are systems with trade-offs. There are good arguments to discuss with Bitcoin mining, how to do it more effectively, how to, all of these things. There are criticisms and ways to improve any system, but we're trying to get into the fact finding first to just talk about what it is. And I think that's a great comparison that you just did between proof of stake. And again, I'm not one of those people that I just think because of proof of work and Bitcoin, that makes it the best, most secure form of money. And I don't think you can have the best, most secure form of money on a proof of stake system because of what you just described. If they want to do other things, their choice. You know what I mean? Like, it's not my thing. So I don't view it as a competition or even comparison the way that some do between these two systems. But I think that's a good comparison, as one is a bit more man-made and incentivized, in my opinion, the proof of stake. The other is backed by physics and energy. And once you really understand that, the US government, if they wanted to come in and manipulate or change anything in Bitcoin, just like you said, they would have to put forth, at this point, more energy than is even physically possible time wise and money wise,
Yeah.
into the system. They'd have to coordinate at a global scale. It's just very difficult to see any of that actually happening, which makes it incredibly secure. Now, it's not physically impossible, hypothetically, like you mentioned at some point. But again, there's always improvements and thoughts of how to make Bitcoin more secure and things like this. But very hard to imagine under proof of work. That's why it's such a strong and sound money. So I think that was
Exactly.
a great breakdown.
Yep.
Now, last year, because we could go for weeks
Which was.
onto this and all of these topics, but I want to get into, because some folks might notice it's been a little calm. I think by the time this episode comes out too, it's been a little calm in what's known as the mempool, when you're able to see fees and like fees to actually transact on the network. So Bitcoin miners, they get rewards, but they also collect fees in terms of processing. I know we could dig into this phrase too, even the, saying processing transactions, but in terms of, the transaction fees to send Bitcoin. And sometimes someone will notice that, let's say I wanted to send $100 worth of Bitcoin to Ben. One day when fees are lower on the Bitcoin main chain, that might cost 50 cents, 20 cents US dollar. Other days you'll notice, oh my gosh, that was $15 of fees that was to be made in that moment. That's really expensive, and we can get into how expensive that is compared to actual traditional wires. It's still relatively cheap compared to that. But some people might be a bit confused by fees, and then a response to fees, one of many, is something like the Lightning Network. So maybe we can spend the last 10 minutes talking about that.
Yep, sure. So I think probably the first place to actually start is why fees exist, because otherwise it's hard to
Mm,
really talk about why the response to the fees exists. So
yeah.
I mentioned earlier that a block doesn't just contain a single transaction, a single UTXO as its output. It contains multiple. So there are lots of different transactions which each contain multiple inputs, multiple outputs, and those get written into the block. And the block has a certain size limit in terms of the amount of bytes that can go into it. Because of that, not everyone who sends a transaction is necessarily going to get it into the next block. And blocks happen, like I said, around every 10 minutes on average, because of this difficulty adjustment. So when you think about that, you realize there's going to be competition for getting your transactions into the blocks. When I make a transaction, what I actually do is I take the money out of the one box and I put some into one or more boxes, but some of it I don't put into any box at all. Some of the Bitcoin that I took out of my box, I just leave there. It doesn't have an output. Anything that I leave there is allowed to be taken by a miner, and it's referred to as the transaction fee. So obviously what miners will do in order to increase their profits as much as possible, because they are profit-driven businesses, is they will take the transactions which have the highest transaction fees first. So if I am a miner and there's, let's say, 10,000 transactions, and I can only fit 2,000 of them into this next block, which I'm building, I will take the 2,000 transactions which have the highest fees, and I will put them into this block. And then the next block, I will take the next 2,000, assuming no new ones have come in, which of course they will have by then. But, I'm going to take the next lot and put them in with the next amount of highest fees. So as a user, if I send a transaction with a very low fee, so I send it with, for example, 1 Satoshi per byte is the usual way you calculate fees, is how many Satoshis per byte. I send a transaction with a fee of 1 Satoshi per byte. It's a 200 byte transaction. So there's going to be 200 Satoshi in fees. The miner is going to far prefer to take the one paying 5 Satoshis per byte over mine. Mine is only going to make it in once all of the other higher paying transactions have been processed, have been taken by the miners and put into new blocks. So the amount of time that it takes for a Bitcoin transaction to actually appear in a block is variable based on the amount of fees that you pay. This leads to this kind of fee market, this fee competition, where people are paying a lot of money to get important transactions processed as quickly as possible.
Can I give a really loose
Sure.
metaphor here? So
Yeah.
in traditional finance, for people that have apps and things like that, whether it's Venmo, something like that, a lot of companies have been instituting like instant pay to your, let's say you have a balance on here in the US on your Venmo, or I think Cash App does it as well. You can do a traditional withdrawal from that. Let's say you have a balance of $100 and a traditional withdrawal is free for you. but it takes 3 to 5 days to land in your bank account. You can do an instant withdrawal for like $5 or $3.99, and it will instantly appear when really it's a trust model between the two. It isn't instant, in fact, but it shows up in your bank account within 20 minutes, that number added value. So that's a very loose comparison for people that don't know at all about kind of this transaction model and these settlements. Is you're paying more upfront on Bitcoin to have that faster transaction, which someone might do if they want to settle something immediately. It's very important, it's very timely. You're able to do that by paying the highest fee, like you described. So I just wanted to give that really loose metaphor for folks.
Yeah, no, it's a good metaphor. I think, like I said earlier, all metaphors have their limits, though, and can break down. The important distinction here is that with that, it's a company who is saying, "Hey, you pay us more, and we will institute this kind of trust model and make it go through straight away." Whereas with Bitcoin, it really is the case that there is no centralized entity. Even the miner themselves, they're not a centralized entity. Anyone can run a mining operation, and anyone can choose what transactions they're putting in. Most likely, if I run a small miner at home, I'm not going to be mining a lot of blocks on my own. I'm not going to find the next block so often, but it is technically possible, and I'm choosing what transactions go in there.
Right.
So with mining, you really are just in a direct fee competition, a fee market against others, rather than it being just predetermined by a centralized company. So yeah, that brings us to Lightning. Lightning exists as a response to that kind of thing. That you don't want to always necessarily be paying huge fees, especially on relatively small transactions. There's a bakery not too far from where I live who accepts Bitcoin over the Lightning Network. And if I walk into that bakery and the Lightning Network didn't exist, I want to buy a couple of bread rolls, comes out to about 60 cents, 60 cents euro. And, that's going to be, a few thousand sats, really not so much. I don't want to be paying 50% of that in fees. That's just pointless. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to use Bitcoin in that case. So the Lightning Network exists as a response to that. And the way Lightning works is essentially that you create a multi-signature arrangement between two people, and that gets called a channel. It's a 2 of 2 multisig. So in other words, to write that back to the chain, to write it to the chain, both of us need to agree that this transaction should be written to the chain. Both of us sign it, both of us agree, and then we create a normal transaction and send it to be written to the chain. But because we now have this transaction that we haven't signed yet, what we can do is simply update this transaction and pass it between us as many times as we like with different updated values. So let's say I run a Lightning node, Trey runs a Lightning node. We create a channel between us. I open the channel, so I say, okay, I'm going to put 10 million sats in on my side. Trey puts in 0 on his side, no problem. Anytime I want to send Trey some money, what I actually do is we just agree to update this transaction that's between us, that now says, okay, when we submit this transaction to the network, known as closing the channel, Trey is going to get 1 million sats, and I'm going to get 9 million. And then later, Trey is going to get 2 million sats, and I'm going to get 8 million, because I just sent him another million sats. So we keep on updating this transaction between us without ever broadcasting it to the network. Then eventually, at some point in the unknown future, we can broadcast this to the network, and we both get our fair side of the channel. So we close it out, and we get our side to us. That's a very simple payment channel between two people. Where the Lightning Network gets really interesting is I've got a channel to Trey, but Trey has a channel to somebody else as well. So we'll call this person Alice. So Ben, Trey, and Alice. I want to pay Alice some money. I don't need to open a channel to her. What I can do is say, Trey, prove to me that you are going to give this money. So cryptographically, give me a mathematical proof that you are going to give that amount of money to Alice, and then I will give you this amount of money. It will usually be roughly the same amount, but maybe Trey will take like 1 or 2 sats for himself to act as a routing between me and Alice. Now, instead of paying a few hundred, potentially a few thousand sats for a transaction, I'm paying 1 or 2 sats to make a transaction. All we did was update the channel state between myself and Trey and Alice updated the channel state between them. That is the Lightning Network. You can route over as many hops as you like, and it forms this kind of web of channels between different people, all of which can be updated dynamically, and you don't have to write those channels back to the chain. So it's this very trustless model, but looks like, in some ways, kind of an overlay network on top of the Bitcoin network. It still is secured by the Bitcoin network, though, of course, because at any time, I can close the channel. I can say, this channel I have with Trey, I don't trust him anymore for whatever reason. I think he's spying on me, or he never routes payments properly. There's something wrong with his node. I'm going to close the channel. I can choose to do that, and either we do it cooperatively. So I say, hey Trey, let's close the channel, and we both sign it and submit the transaction, or I can unilaterally close it, in which case I can just broadcast this transaction as it is, and then I need to wait a little bit. There's a lock time on it, just in case I'm trying to cheat and broadcast an old state or something like that. I won't go into the security of Lightning so much, but there's a bunch of ways to make sure that people aren't cheating and sending old states back to the network. So everyone gets their fair share, and there are lock times and so on to make sure that's safer in a non-cooperative close event.
Yeah, and again, for what I love is for those that are super interested in the technical stuff, everything you're saying they can follow and look more into. For those that are not, what the Lightning Network looks like is you can go on any, whether it's iOS, Android, your computer. There's so many different ways to access the Lightning Network, and what you might see is just a simple, what you might think is just like a Bitcoin wallet, and you're just sending and receiving transactions. And again, what we're saying about Bitcoin, not your keys, not your coins. Similar with Lightning Network, there's some nodes that are you don't own your keys. It's kind of a centralized node and key management system, and you send and receive through the Lightning Network, and you're not even thinking about it. Just to buy a cup of coffee, whatever, where you're able to. There's other more complicated ways to run your own Lightning node. Some are more complicated than others, just like we were saying with Bitcoin on chain. But the point of Lightning Network was to kind of bring to fruition that peer-to-peer payment system that has become a bit more challenging on the main chain in terms of scaling, in terms of fees, right? Like you were saying, like to make it actually affordable to do small transactions. I view the Lightning Network personally right now. We'll see where it goes because it's continuously being built. It's still relatively new, being 7-8 years old, something like that point. I mean, Bitcoin in general is 15 years old. So all of this is a new system. I say if you're trying to send something below like $200 or something like that, right? Usually the Lightning Network can handle that pretty decently. That's what we're saying. And then Bitcoin, the future I see is that the Bitcoin main chain will be much more of you're trying to wire massive amounts of money, or you're trying to hold your savings in Bitcoin. That is a main chain function, whereas day-to-day spending, Lightning Network. And we'll have more conversations with you and others on there's other layer 2 and layer 3 functionality for peer-to-peer spending. But that's the biggest thing. And the other analogy that I like, again, back to your point of no analogy is pure, is I've heard the bar tab analogy used a bit with Lightning, very, very loosely here, people. So, you open a tab at the bar, they're like, oh, you want to keep it open? Sure. Well, imagine if you kept that tab open for a few hours, a few weeks, a few months, whatever. That is the Lightning Network. You're opening a tab, and then at some point, like you described, you're closing it and settling on that base chain. That's how I like to loosely think about it. But again, the Lightning Network is its own web of complexities, possibly more complex than Bitcoin, and still in development in so many different ways, I'd say to folks.
So I think with the bar tab analogy, where it gets maybe a little bit stretching the analogy, is that not only can I keep on paying for my drinks, but now the bar can take some money off my tab that I then give it to my friend who walks into another bar and buys a drink.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
in order that one bar has then paid the other bar for, I don't know, some kind of service which they're providing, or whatever. It's a two-way approach. What I actually find is a very good analogy for thinking about it is, if you imagine everyone is holding an abacus between them, and I'm simply sliding some beads backward and forward between us, that analogy actually works quite nicely to think about
Mm,
the liquidity problems, and that's something we
yeah.
didn't talk about here. But when I gave that example earlier, I opened a channel to you, and there were 10 million sats on my side at the start. There was 0 on your side. That actually means you wouldn't be able to pay me across that channel because there's no money on your side of the channel. All the money was on my side. After I've paid you some, you would be able to pay me some
Mm,
because there is now money on both sides of the channel. You can think of that kind of like an abacus with the beads, and you're just sliding them across. So I slide some beads
mhm,
across to you, you slide some back to me, and we keep on doing that until at some point we decide, okay, we put down the abacus and how many beads are on my side, how many beads are on your side. That's what we get paid out as UTXOs on chain at the end. So
mhm.
yeah, there are different analogies for thinking about it, and each of them has their strengths and weaknesses and limitations. But yeah, it is like you say, it's its own thing, and no analogy is perfect.
Well, Ben, I think we gave people a lot to think about in this one episode.
Cool.
It's I always love going back into the fundamentals because anytime I hear something explained in just a slightly different way, then it causes me to think more. So, for folks that are listening to this, if you're tracking everything we talked about, good on you. It can be complex. If you're overwhelmed and like what does all this mean, I'm going to post other links and things for folks to follow up on. We're going to do more episodes like this. I'm going to kind of post and share other folks that talk about these things day in and day out and do tutorials. I would encourage everyone too to play around with different apps and tools within Bitcoin and Lightning, and you'll kind of see the complex things that we started to touch on. You'll see it in reality, and there are varying levels, like I described. Of it's kind of like again, a loose analogy. You're not going to know the inner workings of your laptop or your computer, right? We were talking a lot about the behind the scenes stuff to try to get the point across of what is securing the Bitcoin network, why it is good money, and why we think Bitcoin is headed for a bright future and a very, very secure and stable future. That was kind of the point of this for my friend who was like, "How does it work? What are the fundamentals?" Well, this episode was for you. So Ben, I want to thank you for doing this. I think you're one of the best to talk about this stuff, balancing, not balancing, the technical components with giving some metaphors, but not doing it too lightly because some of the metaphors just won't work. Sometimes you have to get into it a little bit. So, I appreciate your time and jumping into this conversation with me.
No, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having the conversation, and I'd be happy to come back anytime for further talks.
Absolutely. I think we'll definitely do that. All right. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.